I grew up in the late 90s near Saint Helens, Oregon, which is half an hour directly north of Portland. It is forest on all sides except for where it reaches down to the Columbia River there, big logging town back in the day. I had a summer job between my sophomore and junior year working for my aunt and uncle. Basically, they owned a lot of property up on the hills and would grow specific trees and then let a company come in and cut down acres at a time for lumber. They'd have me go through and sort of clear out brush in specific areas to make it easier for the trucks to get through if the roads were overgrown. It was probably my third week hacking blackberry bushes. Up there by myself in 90-plus heat with a machete. Not the best job I ever had. So I got to the end of a road and there's a sort of clearing there. Super silent except for the bugs buzzing everywhere. And then I hear this giant crack, like a branch falling, which was pretty typical, or at least not unusual. But then it happened a second time, then a third. When it continued to happen, I knew that this wasn't just some trees falling. There was someone or something nearby making this noise. This was before cell phones were really a thing. Nobody really had them. So I had to make a choice. One, I could go back down the road to my truck, probably 3/4 of a mile, or two, I could wait and see if this sound continued and what it was. Back then I was a whole lot braver than I am now, or I guess you could call it stupid. Fine line between the two, I guess. I stayed where I was, standing in the clearing, machete in my left hand. The branches or trees or whatever it was continued to crash, and it seemed to be getting louder and closer. It went silent all of a sudden. And right then something whipped past my head. Then something else. Looked down and I thought it was rocks at first glance, but it was actually chunks of dirt, like it had been ripped out of the ground one handful at a time. The chunks kept coming and the pieces were getting bigger. One was the size of a football, and then a tire, and so on. I was surprised I hadn't been hit. I mean, I'd been dodging the incoming piles, but there was a lot of it coming at me. Then again it went silent, and the chunks stopped coming, and the branches started crashing again. Suddenly, what looked like an entire tree comes hurling down the hill. I jumped off to avoid it and knocked myself off my feet. There's just a huge amount of dust in the air at this point, and I'm covered in that dry, splintery kind of wood. I then looked up to where it had all been coming from, and I swear to God there's a guy standing there. Well, sort of a guy. I mean, it's Oregon, so someone living in the woods off the land wouldn't be as unusual as it would be in other places. But this guy, he's huge, like 12, maybe 15 feet. It's hard to tell because he's on a hill, but this was not just some Bigfoot. I wiped the dirt and wood rot from my face and looked back up. He's gone. I then hear it. The crashing goes on for a while. I feel like he's running away because the noise keeps getting quieter and further. I then took advantage of the quiet, knowing everything was at least at a standstill, and then I took off back to my truck. When I got back to it, I wheeled it around and took off faster than I should have in four-wheel drive. Also, I never went back. I quit the job even though my parents threw a fuss because my aunt and uncle were annoyed. But there was no way I was going back up there. I told them what happened, and they went up and looked around. I think they didn't expect to find what I described, so they figured out a way to just rationalize it. They said it was obviously a landslide. But I know that it wasn't just a landslide. The way those chunks of dirt were tossed through the air, it was like someone was aiming for me. Since then, I have tried to see if anyone else has had a similar experience up there. I ask as many people as I can who have lived in the area for a while. Once I met this one guy who works at a pawn shop who had something sort of similar happen to him. He said it happened back in the 80s when he was hiking on the other side of the same hill I was on. We've gotten together a couple times and compared descriptions of what we remember it looking like. He thought it was even taller than I did. He said he remembers it having a sloping back with long arms that were longer than normal and really dark yellow eyes. I can tell you for a fact there was someone there. I can also tell you for a fact that it was not Bigfoot like lots of people would want to instantly say when they think of a creature in the woods of Oregon. However, I've come to believe that it was a mountain troll protecting its territory. My relatives sold that piece of property eventually, without felling any of the trees. I don't know who ended up with it, but I think about going up there again one day. I'm from out here in Nevada, and we've got some weird stuff out here. I'm a security guard for the East Basin Mall. It's in the suburbs, a couple hours north of Vegas. I work the night shift, and it's a quiet sort of upscale area. Most of the time I'm just watching the camera feed with the guys and trying to run down the clock. At the beginning and end of each shift, I have to do a sweep. This is when me and 3 other guys walk the grounds and check that everything's all right. We take a lap outside the mall, then check each floor. It takes about an hour to walk the whole thing. My shift starts at 1 in the morning. Me and the guys start our sweep by checking the parking lot. There aren't supposed to be any stragglers aside from our own cars. We do our sweep and are ready to head back inside. When we're on shift, there's only one door we use to get in and out, and I always double-check that it's locked behind us. We reach the door and it's locked just how I left it. Now we're inside and patrolling the first floor. All the stores have been locked up for the night. We've only got half the lights on, so we all have our flashlights out just in case. I hear something moving around by the escalators, so I shine my light there. I don't see anything, so I figure it's just the mice. We head up to the second floor when there's this weird clicking sound, like someone's clicking a pen really fast but louder, and we can't tell where it's coming from. We're waving our flashlights all over the place but can't catch anything. One of the guys calls into the security team back in the office. He asks them to check the camera feed over where we're at. They say they don't see anything either. The sound keeps getting louder and it's got this odd rhythm to it. Now the thing is, we're on the second shift of the night. The mall's been locked up for almost 4 hours, and like I said, there's only one door we're using to get in the place. I'm thinking that it's either some equipment malfunction or some animal got in during the day and got lost. I told the security team to turn on the rest of the lights. Then we keep going on our rounds. We finish checking the rest of the floors, and the noise is gone. We don't see anything. All the stores are completely shuttered. They've got those metal curtains pulled down over the front windows. They're locked. It's literally impossible for anything to have broken into one of the stores. So now that things are all quiet, we're really resting easy, right? Because preventing a robbery is half the job. We're just about to hit the office when there's this loud banging noise in the walls. We're in the basement where the offices begin, and it's just a bunch of normal lock and key doors. Someone could definitely be in there, but we would have seen it, or the office guys would have seen it. And now we're trying to follow the sound. The banging's coming from this one office in the middle of the hall. I run to our office to grab the master key. By the time I get back and we open the door, the noise is echoing even louder, but the office is empty. So we lock the office back up and go join the other security guys. The banging sound is coming from somewhere above us. By now, we've turned on all the lights in the mall, and I decided we should do another sweep. I grabbed my guys, and we headed back up. We try to follow the sound as best we can, but it disappears for a few minutes, comes back. We're really chasing it all over. We got to the second floor trying to follow it, and I figured something must have gotten into the vents. That's the only way it could cover that much ground, and it's moving fast. We're running all over the place trying to keep up with it. We make it to the food court and stop. At this point, we've been chasing this thing for an hour, and we're all tired. All the lights in the mall are turned on. I'm sitting down trying to catch my breath and trying to figure out how to write this up in the incident report. Something clicks right above me, so I look up. There's a ceiling tile moved out of place and this skinny white head poking out of it. It's got these big black eyes, and that's all I see before it's back in the vent. I can hear it clicking as it moves away. Now I don't know what I saw, but I asked the guys, and I'm the only one who got a look at it. We radio back to the office. They say they didn't catch anything on the cameras. The banging is far away now. We decided to head back to the security office. We keep hearing that banging and clicking, but none of us want to chase it anymore. It's been moving so fast all night that I had thought it was a raccoon. Whatever it was, we didn't have any business messing with it. That first sighting happened this summer, right before school let out. I'm still working the night shift. There's been a few nights now where we can hear that banging and clicking. I'm trying to get used to it because this is still a pretty good job. I don't want to quit just because of this one thing, whatever it is. But the mall's only so big, and one of these nights I'm going to see it again. Well, I've sure got a tale to tell you. I'm still processing it in all honesty, and my therapist says it's better to talk about it than to keep it all bottled inside. So I'll start off with a bit about me. I'm a junior in college at the University of Maine studying environmental science and engineering. I'm a big hiker, and I love to get outdoors in any capacity: running, skiing, tubing, fishing, camping, boating, or even bird watching. It is just a peaceful activity for me, and again, my therapist says it's good for me because it gives me some time away from my anxiety and peace and quiet. I wouldn't say I'm too skilled at bird watching, but I've gotten better this last semester because I took a class in ornithology. There are a few main points to birding that I learned. First, you always need a good pair of binoculars. Second, a field guide can be your best friend, but also your ears can be your most useful tool. Birds make all kinds of different calls depending on what they are trying to communicate. They might call for a mate, or that they've spotted food, or as a warning, or to communicate directions, or to signal danger. Some birds have lots of different calls and sounds and songs, and they usually have a variety of different pitches and vocalizations along with them. I've memorized the most common sounds here in the Northeast, and can do a pretty good job matching them up with the correct bird. I've also been out hiking enough to recognize the look of most, depending on if they're a male or female, or a fledgling or an adult or a senior. There's a lot to learn, and I've been determined to learn it all. I've been going out almost every morning on the weekends to see what I can find. Early morning is usually the best time for birding because it's not too hot for them and some of their predators aren't up yet or have just gone to bed. You know what they say, the early bird gets the worm. I'd been hiking for about a mile in at Moose Point State Park, and I'd seen just about all of the regulars, some dark-eyed juncos, a pair of winter wrens, and a razorbill. It was a busy morning for the birds because it was the day after a big storm. I started to hike up a hill to get a better viewpoint and maybe catch some overstory birds flying by. I found a path that wound up the mountain and took me to a perfect aerial view in a clearing on some dusty rocks. I sat down and took a breather. It wasn't long before I felt a shadow fly over me. I looked up as quickly as I could, but I didn't see anything in the sky. Then I heard rustling in the trees about 100 yards away. I pulled out my binoculars to try and get a better look. All I could see was a hint of a black wing popping in and out of a massive pine tree. The entire trunk was swaying back and forth as needles and branches flew out in all directions. Suddenly, this creature popped out of the tree line. I thought it could have been a vulture or a raptor or an eagle, maybe an osprey, but the wings were far too large, and its face wasn't like a bird at all. In fact, the most shocking thing was that it didn't really have a face at all, only these bright red eyes that were tracking something down below. It had the body of a person almost, but it was covered in a thin layer of black fuzz. Its wings were huge and spread out almost 2 yards wide. I just couldn't believe my eyes. It started to dart down below the trees, and I stood up with my binoculars to follow it. For a while, the whole forest was silent, but then I heard the sounds of a deer. It was certainly a deer bleating and crying from pain. The leaves of another tree shook, and then out of a clearing below, this creature came flying by with a doe stuck between its talons. It was a bit off kilter from carrying its weight, but flapped its huge wings smoothly nonetheless. I followed the beast with my binoculars for as long as I could, but eventually it was out of my sight for good. I sat there in shock for a while, and then made my way down the hill to get out of that forest. As I approached the area where the deer got scooped up, I saw a mess of fallen trees, broken branches, and leaves strewn all about. Certainly a struggle had taken place. I got out of there as quickly as I could and spent the rest of the day Googling what I had seen. Although it seems unlikely to have been this far north, I do believe that I saw what is called a Mothman. It certainly was not a normal bird or bat. I'm going to keep my eyes out for more signs of it, but I probably won't be venturing into those woods again on my own. I want to tell you about a terrifying experience that I had while camping in the Everglades in South Florida. My husband left our tent in the middle of the night to use the facilities, and I woke up when I heard him flat out running back to our campsite. He looked absolutely terrified when he got back to the tent and instantly motioned for me to stay quiet and follow him. I tried to ask him what was going on, but he just kept saying, "Wait, wait," as we walked through the darkness. As we approached the cinderblock building that housed the restrooms, I started hearing weird squeaky grunt noises, and I assumed that he'd come across boars or something. But we walked around the building, back into near total darkness, and it took a few minutes for my eyes to adjust. We followed a well-worn path for a bit, and I wondered how he knew where he was going when Matt pulled me into the trees. The sounds got louder, and suddenly he squeezed my hand and pointed through some leafy plants to what looked like a huddle of large birds. But then one of the creatures stood up. On two legs, it was a gigantic reptilian creature. It must have been 9 feet tall, and it looked like a cross between a human and an alligator. I thought I was imagining the distended jaw, but the moon suddenly came out and illuminated the bizarre facial features. It had half of an enormous snake hanging out of its mouth, and the other half of the snake was clutched in its massive claws. I stood completely still, waiting for my brain to process what my eyes were seeing. I could feel my husband shaking next to me, but I couldn't keep myself from gasping when two more creatures, smaller than the first but still massive, straightened up and looked directly towards the plants we were hiding behind. I could feel my husband shaking next to me, and I knew that I wasn't imagining things. My rational brain kept telling me that since Matt had managed to make his way back to our campsite earlier, that we would be able to get away. But my lizard brain was pumping adrenaline through my body, and I was resisting the fight-or-flight instinct that was screaming at me to turn and run. I don't think I blinked once. I was terrified that they would move closer to our hiding spot in the millisecond that my eyes would be closed. The creatures stood completely still with their snouts pointed in our direction. I was convinced that they were trying to find us by smelling us out, but we were downwind of the light breeze that was moving through the woods. After what seemed like an eternity, my husband grabbed my arm and motioned back toward the path. I took tiny steps. I was terrified of stepping on a stick or crunchy leaves or anything else that would give us away. Once we got back to the path, we walked slowly for 100 yards or so. But soon I couldn't take it anymore and started running flat out toward our campsite, looking over my shoulder the entire time. We spent the rest of the night in our truck with our headlights pointed in the direction we'd come from. Neither of us slept a wink, but agreed that we felt better with the metal shell of the vehicle between us and whatever was out there. We were hours away from home, and we were both so freaked out that it definitely wasn't a good idea for either of us to drive. But still, we knew we both wanted to go back to the spot once the sun was up to see how it looked in the daylight. The only question I asked was, "How did you find your way back to that spot the second time?" He said he just followed the sounds, just like the first time. The hours passed, and the sun started to ride, but I wanted full daylight before we headed back out. As we made our way back to the spot where we had seen the creatures, we listened for the strange pig-like noises we had heard the night before, but didn't hear a squeak. I didn't know if we would be able to find the area again, but Matt pointed out our sneaker prints in the dirt of the path, and soon we were standing in the spot where we'd been hiding the night before. After making sure the coast was clear, we made our way carefully toward the area where the creatures had been huddled the night before. The only indication that something had happened there during the night was a scattering of rattlesnake rattles and a few humongous footprints that looked like they had been left by dinosaurs. Back in the 80s, once a week, I would take the Amtrak from Houston to San Antonio to see my boyfriend. It left around 7 in the evening and arrived at the San Antonio station around midnight. At least that's what the schedule says. But you know Amtrak, it's never on time. In fact, sometimes we'll be sitting there in Houston for an hour or more waiting for the train. Other times we get on the train but get stopped somewhere along the way because of a freight train going through or whatever. Sometimes I don't even know what's going on because a lot of times they don't tell the passengers. Anyway, since it's nighttime, they usually leave the lights off in the train so people can sleep and relax, but I never sleep. I want to know what's going on around me. Since it's dark inside, you can usually see out. I like to watch the little towns go by. You never know what you're going to see out the window. Usually nothing but the backs of buildings, abandoned houses, mobile homes. Once in a while, though, I'll catch something interesting, like seeing into someone's window. Like a little snippet into their life, which I find interesting. One time it was fully dark. I don't remember what time, and we came to stop in the middle of nowhere. Who knows why? Probably a freight train had to use the track. While we sat there, I looked out the window and saw a big warehouse with a couple of lights on outside. It was surrounded by a rusty chain-link fence with a gate in it. The warehouse was one of those corrugated steel things, and it looked like the roof was caving in. Weeds and vines grew all up to the top of it. I figured it wasn't being used anymore, but then why the lights? Someone was paying the electric bill to keep those things on. So I kept looking at it, just wondering whether there might be anything in there, or maybe they just kept the lights on for security. Nothing happened while I watched. I don't know why I kept looking at it. After a while, the train started moving, and just as it did, I saw a car pull up to the gate. I think it was a black car, but it was hard to tell in the dark. The train pulled away before I could see if the car went in the gate. I forgot about the warehouse until a few weeks later, when we got stuck in the same spot again. I guess there must be a sidetrack there. This time, there were 4 or 5 cars parked near the warehouse when we stopped. As always, it was nighttime and hard to see completely, and the lights on the outside of the warehouse didn't exactly shine on the cars. I think there were people getting out of the cars and going inside the building this time. The big door looked like it was open, not all the way, but a crack, like enough for a person to get inside. After a while, I think I saw it close, but with all the shadows, it wasn't that easy to see. I wish I could have gotten a better look at the people, but some of them seemed to have black suits and others wore blue jumpsuits. You know, like the ones mechanics wear. They had some sort of equipment too, but small things they could carry in their hands. At least, I think it was equipment. Now I was really interested, but of course the train pulled away before anyone came back out of the building. But now I was completely invested in this, and I made a plan to start bringing my binoculars with me on future rides. On my next few rides, I waited for the train to get hung up there again, ready with my binoculars in hand, but just my luck, it didn't stop. Weeks passed without us stopping there, and I thought maybe they'd figured it out. Like, maybe the people in the cars knew they were visible to the train and that we might be able to see what they were doing. Maybe 5 weeks later, though, it finally happened again. The train stopped at that same spot, and I could see the warehouse with at least 5 cars in front. A couple of the cars in back had their headlights on. I quickly brought my binoculars up to my eyes and could finally see clearly what was going on. I could see that the warehouse door was open, and I watched as people started getting out of the cars in front. But they weren't all people, though. At least I don't think so. In between 2 of the black suits was a short, gray figure with a big head, and it looked to be naked. Maybe it was a small human, but I don't think so. It had a tiny body and a huge head, so if it was a human, it was disfigured or mutated in some way, and they were kind of dragging it with its feet behind it like maybe it was dead or passed out or sick. I watched as they dragged it inside the warehouse, and then 2 of the jumpsuits followed. They had one of the gray things between them too. Suddenly the headlights turned off and it was just the dim warehouse lights again. I don't think anyone else went inside after that, but it was hard to tell. There was movement and shadows, but none near the door. And then I turned the binoculars back towards the door and watched as it closed shut. I wish I could have watched to see if anyone came out again, but the train started moving. This time I didn't forget about any of it. I kept thinking about that warehouse. I really wanted to know what was going on there. I tried to find the street crossings on a map I went and got at AAA, but I couldn't find it. I wasn't sure where it was, and I didn't see any industrial area near where it seemed like it should be. I even studied the train route to see if there was a side rail that the train might have been on those times when we stopped. I even looked at a bunch of freight rail maps, but I couldn't find it. Dead end, everywhere I looked. The place seemed to be invisible. It wasn't even near a town as far as I could tell. I tried to note the time to figure out how many miles it was from Houston, but the train stopped so often that it was hard to tell. I decided I'd just have to wait to find out more. A few weeks went by before we stopped in that spot again. When we did, I wasn't sure it was even the same place. The only reason I knew it had to be, though, was that I remembered this tree with a big knot in it that was usually right near my window or maybe just a few feet away. The tree was there, but behind it now was a wall. It was one of those concrete walls like they use for sound barriers along the interstate. And the wall was close to the track, just behind the tree. The freakiest part, though, was that it looked like it had been there forever. I tried to see how far it went, but it just went off as far as I could see. I kept asking myself, was this the same spot? It seemed like it couldn't be. That tree, though, looked exactly the same. I need to tell you something that happened to me last year. I was sitting on my porch at my house in Washington late at night, enjoying the view of the starry sky. I heard a high-pitched whirring noise and then saw something quite strange. It was a vibrant blue light that appeared to be spinning. It slowly went higher up into the sky and gradually spun faster and faster. Eventually it disappeared behind a tree, and the whirring noise stopped. Fascinated, I continued looking, waiting for the light to come back, but it didn't. Then suddenly, I heard a huge explosive boom and the cloud lit up a bright green color. It was so bright it was blinding. It was an amazing and bewildering sight to behold. I had never seen anything like it before in my life. The blue light was spinning so fast it looked like a bright star shooting across the sky. The green light that followed was just as spectacular, if not more so. It lit up the entire cloud in a brilliant hue and created an incredible spectacle. I stood there amazed at the sight, completely mesmerized. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Afterwards, I saw green lights falling from behind the cloud towards the ground. I remember thinking that someone must be playing a prank on me, but it was far too epic to be a simple prank. I remember being concerned if some of the green debris would fall on someone's house or cause a fire, but there was really nothing I could do. I was in awe, and I couldn't stop gazing and wondering if I was dreaming. I thought that was going to be the most eventful part of the night, but I was wrong. Something quite disturbing happened afterwards. A strange-looking black van drove slowly into the field in front of my house. The windows were all blacked out, and it drove very slowly. I don't get many visitors, and nobody lives around me, so I got very weirded out by the van. It disturbed me enough that I went into the house, locked the door, and peered out the window. The van sat in the field for about 10 minutes. Finally, I decided maybe I was being paranoid and fixed myself some tea. While drinking the tea, I kept trying to come up with a logical explanation for what I saw in the sky, but for the life of me, I couldn't explain it. It had to be extraterrestrial. Either that, or it had been some strange experimental government aircraft. But why the green explosion? I looked out the window again about 30 minutes later, and the van was still sitting in the field. I called my friend who works as a truck driver and was in a different state at the time and asked him what I should do. He told me it was probably nothing but to keep watching and call him if anything else happened. I hung up and tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I went back outside and sat down on the porch. My mind was racing with the possibilities of who was in the van. I eventually told myself it was just some teenagers having sex in the field and laughed it off. The van suddenly began to move again. I told myself that the teenagers had finished what they came to do, and a sense of relief came over me. It drove very slowly towards my house and then stopped right in front. Now my heart started pounding as I wondered what was going on. Suddenly, all the doors of the van opened and 4 men dressed in black suits and sunglasses jumped out. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. They were all holding guns and they started running at me. As they came closer, I could see that their faces were covered with masks. I tried to run into the house, but one of them grabbed me and dragged me back outside. They took me to the van and forced me inside. The last thing I saw before they shut the door was 4 more men getting out of the back of the van with rifles. Then the van drove away, leaving me alone with these masked strangers. I remember waking up after that confused and disoriented with a pounding headache. I felt the grass on my hands, and I started to look around. Once the blurriness left my eyes, I realized that I was in my front yard. I immediately ran inside and called my partner, screaming and crying. After taking some deep breaths and forcing myself to calm down, I was able to tell him what happened while holding back tears. I told him I thought it had something to do with the strange lights in the sky. "What are you talking about?" he asked me. "The blue light and the green explosion that I told you about earlier, Craig," I screamed. There was a brief pause on the phone. "What light are you talking about, Jessica?" He told me I must be in shock from the trauma and I needed to call 911. He had no recollection of me calling him earlier that night at all. This experience has caused me a lot of suffering and confusion. I think about that experience daily, and when I tell people, not many of them believe me. In fact, it has cost me a lot, including some friends and family, my friendships, my career, my credibility, everything. I hope I heal from this experience and get some closure.